It's fun to be here in Wisconsin. I got my BA degree here a real long time ago in cultural anthropology. And shortly after I finished my doctorate, which I did in England, I was coming through Madison, and I decided to give Michael Apple a phone call just in case I could meet the guy. And so I called his office, and he was there, which is kind of amazing. And he said, "Come on over." So I went over to meet Michael Apple. And I'm a bit of a shy person, and so this wasn't especially easy for me, going to meet a famous man. And I found Michael so generous and friendly, and it was wonderful. And then a year later, after 1 year working at Houston University, Michael called me up and said, "Hey, I've been asked to write a chapter for a book on critical ethnography. Would you co-author it with me?" And I thought, critical ethnography? What's that? Oh, sure. And it was in writing that piece that I kind of found my identity as an academic, which is in the area of critical theory applied to research. So I owe Michael Apple quite a lot, actually. And he's not even here. I guess he's in Spain. I've been here before looking for him too, and he was somewhere else. So. Now this talk, it's based on a chapter I wrote this summer for a book. It's kind of a dense topic, and it has a lot to do with philosophy and its connection to research. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and I don't think I'm the best speaker in the world, so sometimes I don't convey things all that well. So I'm just warning you, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. The name of the talk is Knowing as Being, and the topics I want to go through are, I'm going to be talking about the misnaming of qualitative social research. I mean, in some ways, qualitative social research shouldn't be called qualitative. It's a misleading expression. Then I'm going to be talking about one, the mystery of oneness. Then that's going to take us to Kant and the insight Kant had that he called transcendental. And then we're going to move to Hegel. And with Hegel, we're going to be exploring the relationship between certainty, being certain, feeling certain, certainty, and the concept of truth, and the concept of being. And it's that section that would, if I'm successful, will deliver what's promised in the title, Knowing as Being. So let's see how it goes. The word critical is quite popular and has been for some time. We find it in expressions like critical race theory, critical ethnography, critical pedagogy, critical feminist theory, critical participatory action research. That's what the name of the book my chapter is going to. Anyway, critical finds itself in lots of expressions, and the sense it's given varies in terms of the discourses in which it's used, but in general, the idea is that knowledge and the production of knowledge is somehow related to power. Knowledge and power have some kind of an internal relation that researchers need to be cognizant of. And in addition, if you see the expression critical this or critical that, you know that the authors are critical of modern day social formations, our class system, racism, sexism, homophobia, those kinds of things. We want to change those things. Okay. But there's a special sense to critical that originates with the term critical theory. Critical theory, as you know, was an expression that came out in the 1930s from people in Frankfurt, Germany, who were trying to disguise what they were doing from the Nazis, and so they used the expression critical theory. It's an expression that deliberately uses critical in the sense that Kant gave critical. Kant's critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, critique of judgment. That's what the term was alluding to, critical. Now Kant he was no Marx. He was a philosopher who he never left his hometown. I think maybe he did once, but how could his sense of critical be related to the sense of critical and critical theory? What's the connection? Well, the connection is really special. It's quite exciting. It's paradigm changing. It's hard to fully grasp, and it's person changing. In my life, I find I'm still struggling to get a full grasp of the insight involved. It's really a drastic paradigm change. And there are various ways that one can set up a framework for discussing, for bringing people into a domain where we can talk about these special senses of critical. And I'm going to use one today that I haven't used before, which is it has to do with the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. And the one reason I'm framing it like this is last semester I had to teach a course in general research methods in education. And I agreed to do it because we were short-staffed, but I thought, I don't want to teach that course. But I did. And that meant I looked at a lot of books and articles that introduce people to educational research. Also, I looked in sociology, anthropology, and they all talk about qualitative research and quantitative research. I didn't find a single one that really conveyed a good understanding to me of what qualitative researchers do. It was really, really misleading stuff. And these are books by people like Cresswell and Borg and Gall and Borg and I don't know, I forget a lot of the other names, but I think a lot of you will be familiar with those textbooks. Some of them say, well, in quantitative research our data is in the form of numbers, but in qualitative research our data is in the form of words, and that's the difference. Okay. Well, the more I thought about it, the more I decided we shouldn't even call qualitative social research qualitative. Not that that's ever going to go down, but here's the reason. The word qualitative is related to the words quality, qualia, and it's a concept that originates with the paradigm of object perception for knowledge. Knowing is seeing something. And when we examine objects, we find that they have qualities, and it's their qualities that enable us to distinguish one object from another object. So we know that's a chair because we're cognizant of its size, its shape, really. And we can contrast it with other chairs through things like its color, textures, the length of its runners on the bottom, that kind of thing. Those are all qualities. Okay. So quality comes up as a concept in the context of thinking of knowledge with the paradigm of seeing. Knowing is like seeing things, and things can be studied either qualitatively or quantitatively. So in chemistry, for example, this qualitative data analysis, there was a time in my life when I thought I'd be a chemist. So I study a lot of chemistry, and qualitative analysis in chemistry, it just means you're identifying the substances that are within something like a gas or a liquid, something you're interested in, and it means you're not looking at the quantities or ratios numerically specified. You're just getting at the qualities that the substance is composed of. Again, it's entirely dependent on being in an observer's position and knowing through observing, knowing through seeing. So, in the physical sciences, to explain things that we observe, the patterns that we see, it becomes necessary to postulate transcendent entities like electrons, neutrons, force fields, electromagnetic waves, things that we don't observe, that we don't perceive, but that we need to postulate in order to explain what we do. And we create models, which means knowledge in the form of a model is knowledge having representation as the key concept. To know is to have an accurate representation of something. Okay, this is something we also critique in critical epistemology. We say representation is secondary, not primary mode of knowing. The transcendent entities in physical research are ontologically of the same kind as the entities that we experience, that we do see. So when we experience chairs and tables and apples and things like that, we regard them as substances made of matter that persist in space and time, that have a spatial location and that persist in time. And it's the same with the postulated entities that we call transcendent. Not transcendental, but transcendent. It means supersensible. It means they're postulated, but they're not experienced. Okay. In psychology, the transcendent involves things that have an ontologically different status than what we actually perceive. So psychologists are interested in people's emotional states, people's capacities, intellectual capacities, capacities for empathy, whatever it may be, people's self-esteem. These are all things that are ontologically different from what we actually experience through our senses. So the transcendent in psychology is based on a different principle than in the physical sciences. But psychologists still, in the mainstream, they use methods of inquiry that are like the methods we use in chemistry and physics. We do observations and you construct models. So let's think about that paradigm of knowing just a little bit before we move on into something new. If knowing is thought, if the root metaphor is perception, then the tendency is to think ontologically in terms of being, things existing, as being distinct from time. Being and time are distinct. Something has being if it persists in time. We think of motion as something that has its own being but happens to be in motion. What it is isn't defined by the fact that it's in motion sometimes and not other times. So there's the ontology based on the idea of objects with qualities that can persist in time. The way we study them comes from postulating a universal observer position, a subject position any possible subject in principle could take, and agree with whatever knowledge claims you make. It's actually a universal observer position and instrumental actor position, because modern physics has come down to definitions that increasingly are operationalized so that the definition of a concept becomes the measurement process that you use to get your measurement. And that involves instrumental actions, interventions in the world. And these are specified by very strict rules called operational definitions that are very tightly and explicitly worked out so that any other person could replicate what's being done. And then the claim is if I'm saying that my model is true, that has validity, then anybody could repeat what I've done, follow exactly what I did, and get the same results. So, operationalized definitions are an essential feature of this form of acquiring knowledge. Validity. When is knowledge valid and when is it not? Well, when we're pursuing knowledge this way with model making, validity is based on accurate prediction. So our model is accurate, it has validity insofar as we can make predictions from it, test those out, and if the predictions come true, that supports the validity. All right, let me think. I think those are the main points I want to cover on the characteristics of mainstream research based on perception, thinking of knowledge as perception. Okay. When we look at what qualitative researchers do, however, the situation is rather different because we're not, when we're doing our qualitative research, we're trying to understand people. And so meaning is very important to us, understanding meaning. And meaning, what kind of answer could you give to the question, what's the ontological status of meaning? In what sense does meaning exist? What can we say about that? Well, I'm sure you can think of some very reasonable things to say, but it gets a little harder if we say, well, meaning is always expressed with human beings within a cultural context. Meaning depends on culture, and expressions that are meaningful reproduce, contribute to culture. What's the ontological status of culture? In what way can we say a culture exists? What is that all about? Well, that's a very difficult philosophical question, not an easy one. And answers that are most compelling seem to be mainly partial. Anthony Giddens, for example, the British social theorist, he talks about structure as the medium and the outcome of action. And we can translate that over to culture is the medium of action. You have to have it to act. But it's also the outcome, because every act you do claims cultural themes in slightly different ways, slightly new ways. Culture iterates, it changes as a result of action. And that's kind of a helpful formula. It's not real different from Hegel's concept of Geist, or spirit, which is, Hegel's conception is difficult and it involves an understanding of dialectics. And I'm going to get to Hegel in a little while, so I won't try to say any more about that now. Okay. Anyway, qualitative researchers don't really study qualities. We're interested in meaning, we're interested in culture, we're interested in the kinds of human identities that are made possible in cultures. We're interested in things that are neither subjective nor objective. They're not objective because they're not open to sensory access. They're not subjective because they don't persist in one person's mind. That doesn't really work to say it's the collection of what's in everyone's mind somehow is what we mean by culture. And there's another reason why it's ontologically tricky, which is that culture is something that's fundamentally implicit when we're talking about lived culture. Understanding how to act with people, that's culture. Understanding how to talk. Understanding very subtle things about what's considered right, wrong, proper, very subtle things. That any articulation of them is an interpretation. If you talk to people about the culture that they live in, they can talk to you, but they're interpreting as well. They're not describing to you, they're interpreting. And so the researchers interpreting, people we work with are interpreting. The object of study, when it's culture, is inherently unavoidably implicit, can't be made explicit. So ontologically, what does that mean? That's another kind of a tricky question. Somebody signal me when I've talked too much, okay? First, you'll feel a little heavy feeling behind the eyes, and then you can look at the clock and then just raise your hand. What I'm going to talk about now has to do with one, the concept of one, okay? So let's stick with object perception. Let's go back to it again. Let's think about it again. Now, one reason I find this kind of thinking useful is because of the kind of experience I had last semester and the kind of experience I've had for many years getting on doctoral dissertation committees that have a lot of professors who mainly do quantitative research and don't really know, what my qualitative students are doing, don't understand it very well, and it's very, very difficult to get very basic ideas across, like not all knowledge ought to be in models. Models is not the only form of knowledge, please. And validity as prediction, not all knowledge is that way. There's knowledge, important knowledge, that you don't validate by making predictions and then checking them out. How do you validate them then? Well, that's where we're going. We're going to explore that idea real soon. But right now we're talking about one. When we perceive an object, we perceive qualities. So our actual central experience can be broken down into qualities. So we can say, I'm looking at that chair and I see black, I see tan, I see something that I can almost feel as a texture, and I'm describing its qualities. But I also see it as a one. I also see it as something singular. And Western philosophers have argued for centuries about what that means. How can we explain one? It's not one of the qualities something has. It's not centrally experienced. It's not an object. It's not a component of something. It's not there. Where is it? There's a whole field of philosophy called mirology. That's all they do is argue about that. The one and the many problem, the many and the one problem. So how do we handle that one? Well, Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the guy who started phenomenology in its modern form, he argued that there's something called categorical perception or intuition. Categorical intuition, that a concept comes with that's non-sensory, that's part of the perceptual experience. So he distinguished between the categorical part of the perception and the sensual part of the perception. Before him, Kant had a different way of trying to deal with this problem, and that seemed to be looking more in here than out there to get at the one. And Kant's ideas actually, they're the ones I'm going to be emphasizing here in this talk today. Kant noticed that when we have experiences of objects, there's a component of recognition involved. We recognize that as a chair. We don't see a chair, we recognize that as a chair. And so there's a concept involved in the perception, chair. And we can be wrong. We can think that's a chair and get closer and find out it's really a stool. Or we can call that a chair and somebody else can say, what are you talking about, man? That's not a chair, it's a car. Who knows what? Anyway, it's because we can be wrong that we have the difference between experience and what experience is of. Otherwise we wouldn't have a concept of experience. Things would just be, right? We wouldn't have to make that distinction. But because we can be wrong, we have the concept of experience, and we see that experience is intimately related with concepts. Concepts come out in experience when we can question an experience, or when we can experience an expectation that fails us because we got it wrong, the perception wrong. We judge, there was a pre-conscious judgment made that was wrong. That's an interesting idea, because if somebody says, well, people have concepts, just pause a minute. That's not a really helpful explanation, having concepts. That suggests, well, we have a mind, and then the mind has within it concepts, and teachers teach students concepts so that their minds will become filled with concepts. Anyway, this way of looking at concepts is more phenomenological, and there's no mind in the picture. There's no self in the picture. There's just the experience of something as something. If we add mind into the picture, something that can possess concepts, then we're going to metaphysics. We're postulating, we're putting a model in there. And we don't want to do that, not prematurely. So, in Kant's philosophy, you have a system of transcendental categories that all of our sense experiences involve. We can't escape them, and yet they themselves are not experienced. Okay, so transcendental refers to things that are necessary for experience, but are not themselves experienced. You have to do some reflection to uncover them. Here's what would probably help if I had a board or something, but I don't. So if I wrote something down, it just might be easier for me too, because I forget what I've said after a while, you know. Concepts like chair are learned, but they are formed upon more basic transcendental concepts in Kant's theory, like an object in general, for example. And Kant thought that these were simply part of consciousness. Consciousness involves transcendental concepts. Well, that's kind of interesting, and it helps to explain what he called the experience of categorical unity. So when you experience something as a unity of different parts, that's categorical unity. When you experience a chair, the chair is the category, and you're experiencing categorical unity. Okay, but now we get to the fun part, non-categorical unity. Non-categorical unity. Kant noticed that experience itself is always unescapably unified. Now, he tried to argue for this in a number of different ways, and my sense is really, you can't argue for this in a way where you have sort of premises and a series of argumentation with a conclusion. You have to be awakened. You have to kind of really be awakened to this idea that he was trying to express as non-categorical unity. And one of his ways of arguing for it, or trying to bring his readers into awareness of it, is my favorite one, is the fact that we all experience is inescapably my experience for each of us. You can't escape an experience being mine, my experience. If one of you can do that, please tell me, because I can make you rich, and I'll get 10% of it. You can't escape mineness, okay? It's always my experience. Well, that's kind of interesting. Let's actually look at some quotations from Kant. How am I doing on time, by the way? Could someone tell me? If you guys don't tell me, you're going to be stuck here all day.
12:40.
12:40, and what time should I?
You have 40 more minutes.
40 more minutes. Ah! And none of you's died yet or anything. I'm really happy. Okay, so Kant based some of the ways he was trying to articulate this insight he had on things written by Leibniz, a philosopher earlier than him. And Leibniz had come up with this idea of apperception. Apperception. Perceive with. Apperception. And here's what Leibniz writes about apperception when he introduces it in a book called Principles of Nature and Grace. Leibniz writes, "Therefore, it is well to make a distinction between the perception, which is the internal condition of the monad representing external things, and the apperception, which is consciousness or the reflective knowledge of this internal state. The latter, apperception, not being given to all souls, nor at all times to the same soul." It's a state of awareness he's talking about. So that means being aware of the unity of experience. Just being aware of the unity of it. If we're not aware of that, it's no problem. We just see a chair and we move over and sit on it and we ask somebody to get us a cup of tea or whatever. And we're in a flow of activity, and we're not looking especially for the unity of experience. But if we notice the unity of experience, it's kind of startling. Now the reason I got excited about this when I started to read Kant and then Hegel and all these guys was I'd been doing yoga and meditation practice for years first, and that's a very important thing in my life still. It's a spiritual side of things for me that I also find to be really inherently connected with critical theory. Spirituality in a very broad sense, not confused with religion, okay? This awakening to the idea of the unity of experience is like an experience that we have in meditation. And it's quite exciting because it has to do with the mindness. There's something like a self-affirmation that's felt for a flicker when that happens. And it really feels wonderful, and it's something like a unity, and it's very hard to put into words. And if you notice you're having it, then you lose it in meditation. Any of you meditate, by the way? Some of you do? Okay. All right. The rest of you, you don't have to meditate. You can, but if you've ever thought of it, give it a shot. It's nice. Okay. Now let's see what Kant did. Kant changed, he changed the analysis from Leibniz's. And here are a few things he writes about the transcendental unity of apperception. And he's going to use different expressions here. One is transcendental I. Okay? When you hear that expression, transcendental I, if you get a picture in your mind, it's wrong. The transcendental I is essentially not an object. So any thought of it, making it into an object, is wrong. This is where Hegel's going to get involved with dialectics. Another expression he uses is transcendental self-consciousness. Okay, I'll just read a couple of short quotations from Kant himself. The first one is, the original and necessary consciousness of the identity of the self is thus, at the same time, a consciousness of the necessary unity of appearances according to concepts. So what he's really saying there is we experience a sense of self only by experiencing something other than the self. When we notice the unity of experience, there's a sense of self, but it's not the objective part of what we notice. He also calls this, quote, the unity of transcendental self-consciousness. Here's another quotation. In the synthetic original unity of apperception, I am conscious of myself not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am. All that can be said about it is I am. because this idea of self, it's not an object, it has no qualities. There's nothing about it that distinguishes it from another I. Any picture of it's wrong, any model of it's incorrect. And so it's quite a subtle thing. And then Kant writes, so first of all, it's not an experience that he's talking about. It's something that accompanies experiences, but it's not an experience itself. It's something a reflection can reveal. Okay. Secondly, it's not a concept. Kant writes, we cannot even say that this is a concept, but only that it is a bare consciousness which accompanies all concepts. Well, let's see. Maybe we should just see if that makes sense. Anybody want to say something about that? I'm about to move into Hegel, who takes us in a new direction, but anybody want to say something? Or? No? Okay. All right. These days, it's really common to read the self is fragmented, right? Well, this doesn't contradict that claim. The transcendental I doesn't contradict the idea of fragmentation, because the transcendental I would be presupposed in any claim to fragmentation. Fragmentation is an incoherent concept without unity being presupposed, and it tends to be understood on the metaphor of an object that's broken into parts, or parts that one wishes to put into an object but cannot. Okay, transcendental I is essentially not object. All right. This insight of Kant's, okay, I'll say one more thing, then I'll put, this insight of Kant's has everything to do with the idea of freedom and the idea of being a person rather than being an object. The fact that people don't like to be known by other people 100%. If you think somebody else's knowledge encloses you, you'll fight that. You'll fight that. If somebody does research on you and says, I understand this person and their culture totally, and this is how it all works. I have a model, there's a structure, we're going to fight against that. It's oppressive. And why is it oppressive? Because something about us involves that transcendental, we can't be captured as an object. If we feel like we're an object in someone else's eyes, then we lose freedom. And we don't want it. But that's better than being nothing. So we find relationships, dysfunctional relationships, where you see one person oppressed, made to be an object sort of for the other, can't show any creativity without threatening the other, can't show any initiative without threatening the other, has to be controlled. We see relationships like that, and people can get stuck there because it's better to be that than nothing, the biggest existential fear. And we have whole cultures that do that. Person of color in a racist society, that's the message you get. You're encompassed in somebody else's knowledge. We know that's not true, we can feel that's not true, and we have a way of talking about why we know that's not true, and why that has to be fought. A woman in a patriarchal culture, it's the same kind of pressure. You're being pushed towards being more of an object than a subject. You become, somebody else's knowledge explains you. And we have a way of understanding that, or an insight into it. Now I'd like to hear from you. Okay. Maybe you could introduce yourself too.
I'm Miriam. I'm a lab in writing up my dissertation. And you sort of already took the question. I did want to say something about the fragmented self, but I think you already clarified that. But why the necessity to even postulate an essential self? I mean, whether it somehow pre-originates fragmentation or otherwise. I mean, why are we so concerned about an essential self?
Well, I'm just so concerned about, I can't sleep at night. No, I know. Why be concerned about it?
I was just saying that because, you talked about meditation and it felt almost like there is a certain discipline involved to postulating this essential self. There is an effort to make it happen. It's almost a project to faith in some ways. And why is it necessary?
Well, I think there are probably a number of answers to that question. Because partly the motivations would be different depending on what a person's doing, why they're talking as they are, and so on. There's a security issue. It doesn't. People, I think, can feel insecure if they say, "Well, you're not really a self." But there's also something. I mean, it just doesn't quite. It really doesn't quite work. And for me to. I mean, I'll be happy to go through a text with you that is trying to emphasize the opposite. We can ask why there too. What's the thrill in saying that there's no self really? It's just fragmented. If you really want to see some good stuff on that, then we can read Zen Buddhism. And Zen Buddhism isn't really in contradiction with Kant's insights and so on. It's not the idea of the transcendental I, which we're about to leave, by the way. We're going to go to the negative with Hegel. We're going to drop transcendental I in a second. But that idea, the insight that informs it, is it has to do with the completely non-objective. The fact that there are no objects, there's no concept of object, there's no experience of object without a deep underlying contrast with not being subject. And that not being subject is radical, so it's hidden. So I'm not sure which literature you're thinking of, but a lot of the post-structuralist literature I've read presuppose a unified self of the author who's writing the book, of the readers who are supposed to understand the book. And it gets a little annoying because those guys have studied. Anyway, I don't want to go there too far. But go on, say some more.
Well, in my head, when the essential self I contrasted not as much to, I'm contrasting it with the self is co-created, the relational self,
yes.
And therefore multiple, and therefore contingent and contextual, rather than somehow this primordial soup of being, and rather letting, that being worked out in specific places at specific times in the company of specific others.
Yes.
Would
I
that
totally
be
agree with that
different
point of
from
view.
the essential self that you talked about, or is that actually?
Hey, did I ever use the word essential?
Well, all right, that's mine.
I know it's a bad word, I'd never use it. But, a transcendental I is not anything essential. The concept of essentiality is kind of like saying this is what something really is, despite its appearances, okay? And it's hard, it's like this. And that means we could describe it. You can't describe the transcendental I. It's really, really radically not an object. And if I completed the trajectory of what this talk is about, I would move from subject-object thinking into subject-subject. And I would kind of have formulations much like what you're saying. There's a process of individuating that people have. We are completely unique, every one of us, from anything else, and that's that sense of the I again. That's the workings of, that's what that insight is about. Individuation. Simultaneously, that's always claimed. Its being is only claimed. And it's simultaneous with belonging, a we. We, I, me, we, I. So I think the vision you just described is very congruent, actually, with where I'm trying to head. So so be kind when you hear the word transcendental I, okay? Yes?
Can you give us just a sense of where you're headed with your argument about the relationship between self and experience and knowledge and category? Like, what are you going to argue? I'm not...
Okay, so I'm about to go into just some real basic themes in Hegel. And they're going to be about how he connects certainty with being, with truth, and with knowing. And so the category stuff, I mean, you can ask more specifically about that. Categories are culturally contingent, right? And the kinds of things that Kant believed were universal to all consciousness, those transcendental categories, I mean, later thinkers argue, well, there's something sort of like that that culture does. Culture operates kind of like a transcendental structure for people until they notice it, and then they can change culture. Levi-Strauss called his structuralist theory of culture Kantianism without a subject. There's big problems with him, though. But I'm not going to emphasize categories too much. Okay. Thank you. All right, not much longer. Hegel. We have Hegel seminars in Indiana, his logic and the phenomenology. Studying Hegel is really, it's, I don't know, it's a really exciting, liberating kind of experience. It's frustrating too, because the guy couldn't be right. Foucault once wrote somewhere, Foucault wrote, you know, I keep thinking I've got the last nail into the coffin of Hegel, you know, I've completely, and then I read something else by Hegel, and he was already understood he had already anticipated my objection. And a lot of philosophers have made that comment about Hegel. He seems to be standing everywhere you look somehow. Anyway, his work is very important to critical theory and its foundations, very definitely. So I'm going to try to convey some difficult Hegelian ideas fairly quickly, and then we'll have the discussion. Okay. How many of you are familiar with Hegel? Don't be afraid to say you're not. Rochelle, are you? Yeah, Rochelle was in a couple seminars. Okay. Yeah. I keep wondering, why in grade school, why in junior high, why don't we get taught some Kant and some Hegel? I mean, kids could get the basic ideas. Why isn't it taught? I was just lucky I accidentally discovered these guys. My K through 12 education didn't help me one bit in making me aware of philosophies that actually are very important. I mean, they're quite important because we live in a society that has a very limited idea what inquiry is, what knowledge is, and it's all bound up with the economic system and quantifying things so you can get more information and for your profit making and your money distributions or whatever it is. And it's too bad. Okay, Hegel. He tried to work out an entire philosophical system, a totalizing system. It has three main parts: science of logic, and logic doesn't mean what you think logic means for Hegel. Logic are self-moving concepts, starting with being. If you look more closely at the meaning of being, it leads to nothing, and then that leads to becoming, and then that leads on and on. Until you get to a concept that encloses all of the movement toward itself. Then that spills over into philosophy of nature, that spills over into the philosophy of spirit, that spills over into science of logic again. So it's a kind of a circle, spiral system. And leading up to the system is his phenomenology, which has been more popular for a number of decades now than the logic. In the phenomenology, Hegel describes a process of knowing, dialectical process of knowledge, until it arrives at the place where knowing is understood to be the same as being. Being and knowing are one. Okay, but how can that be? Being and knowing are one. Sounds weird, right? Well, the phenomenology uses two main frameworks that are kind of juxtaposed and repeat throughout it. One is cognitive. So the phenomenology begins with a state where we're certain, there's certainty. He calls it sense certainty. There's no doubting. So you could imagine being an earthworm, perhaps, where a sensation isn't giving you a sense of an object. It's just a sensation. Okay. It's just a world of sensations. And certainty, if you try to articulate it, contradicts the articulation. I know it's a hard idea, but you know, Descartes' famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." And it really, maybe a better translation of what he was saying is, I cannot doubt doubting. If I try to doubt doubting, I'm contradicting myself, right? Okay. I can't doubt doubting, and that has something to do with what we mean a lot of times with the word I. I can't doubt the I am. And Hegel has this idea of certainty developed in a whole mode of thinking, Things we take for granted, things that we most deeply do not question, are what we would articulate if someone was trying to say, what are you most certain of? What are you most certain of? And he shows how efforts to articulate that certainty, which at the end of the day is just, it's self-certainty, but this isn't clear. He traces a dialectical process until the point where the basis of truth is found to be self-certainty. When something is true, we know it's true because it reflects back to us what we are. There's an insight in that. This is where identity politics are related to this. We know something's not true when it doesn't reflect back to us what we are. We don't recognize ourselves in it. So we know it's not. We know there's something wrong with it, or wrong with us. We can believe that too. So that's a way to talk about a standard for ideology critique. How do we know that ideologies are false? Well, there's material here that helps to refine and give some kind of a meticulous explanation of that, if we want to do that. We know it because we don't experience ourselves in the culture around us. We don't experience ourselves when we act the way we've been taught to act, when we follow norms, when we use the ideas available in our culture to express ourselves. What comes back isn't reflecting that certainty back to us. Okay, so that's on a kind of cognitive level, but for Hegel, cognition is the same as desiring, it's the same as fearing, it's the same as feeling. It's not, he doesn't work with an idea of thought being distinct from our emotions and everything else. The other mode has to do, instead of a progression towards what is true, we have a progression towards actualizing our being in the forms of life within which we live. So there Hegel's interested in social structures, social relationships, that how we, from within intersubjectivity, we're constantly claiming and co-constructing selves in relationships. And we're drawing on cultural material to do that. And there again, some of those cultures they're oppressive. And so we can be co-constructing something we don't feel to be ourselves. We don't get the self-affirmation we're after. And that's the standard by which we know something's wrong with a culture. So I really compressed that, but I think that was the right thing to do. And I think maybe having a discussion now would be the right thing to do, too. If I were to continue, all of this was a series of arguments that started with object perception and worked towards its limitations. And then when we get through Hegel, it bursts subject-object, and we have to go to subject-subject. And then within subject-subject, we develop our critical epistemology and ontology. But now today, So, any comments, questions?
So how do you think then about the role of experience in knowledge production?
It's a complicated question, right? Because it depends on what you mean by experience. For Hegel, experience is knowing. I mean, when we're experiencing something, we're knowing it in some kind of way. When we use it in education, I think we relate knowing then to some kind of cognitive process whereby we process the experience, or we, the understanding and the experience are maybe separated. I'm not sure. What you can tell me about.
No, it's really something that I'm struggling with myself, but I thought, especially in your early framing of subject-object knowability and the problems with that, you made a comment about qualitative work being primarily about experience and about meaning, or qualitative, because I know you don't like that term, and I think you've got some compelling arguments.
I'm going to keep using it, but what can I do?
The culture is forcing us to use it. But I don't know, I lost it. So I'm trying to think about, I'm not sure all work that we tend to call qualitative is about meaning. Mm-hmm. Much of it is about meaning, and some of it is partially about meaning, but also about inequality or structures or those kinds of things, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of, I guess I'm trying to get at, with your reformulation of subject-subject, what is the role of experience in making knowledge? And it's something that I've thought about too. I'm primarily an ethnographer.
Oh yeah.
And I think about experience is so central to the ethnographic enterprise.
Yeah.
But it's not through participant observations and through eliciting others' analyses of their experiences, which I loved it the way you said it, like every, I won't say it as eloquently as you did, but every explanation of a cultural phenomenon is an interpretation.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that, right? So I'm interested in like the role that experience plays in ethnographic knowledge production, but then I'm also interested in other qualitative forms where many times researchers are making sense of data that someone else experienced and documented, right? If there's a research team. So that's how I'm coming at that question that I'm trying to pose. I can't even quite formulate.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to just keep giving my own ideas. Do you have some ideas about?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Well,
I mean, I probably do,
for
but I'm
me,
not as coherent with them yet
Yeah.
as you are.
Well, for me, like the limit case of doing real critical research, the limit case, that means the limit, like a math, the thing we'd like to get close to would be full participant, not even observation, participatory action. And that means you're with a community of people, and all of you are trying to figure things out. So you learn together how to talk about experience. I saw a pretty good example of this in Indiana just about a week ago over faculty disputes we're having down there involving racial issues. And it was when I was in a room of people, and we were supposed to talk about how to make the School of Education better. It wasn't quite as bad as let's write a mission statement, things like that. But it was very constrained. And then one person in the room, and it's Jim Shorrock, maybe some of you know Jim, he just said some stuff that just resonated with us all. He just cut through all the bullshit, all the inhibitions, because he can talk real honestly and directly. And what happened, I felt in the room, was our experience all of a sudden was validated because of what he said. And then it was like a freeing, and then we could all talk much better, and we were talking about our experience, but by doing that, we change our experience and we clarify. A lot of times we don't quite get what our experience is, right? So being able to talk about with others and getting something back is itself a freeing process. And to me, that would be how a lot of ethnographic work can work like that, or could in the limit case. But there's also things like, the other thing I think you mentioned is we have a lot of examples of obvious forms of oppression, laws that need to be changed, economic policies that need to be changed. And in those cases, we get together and we have a goal that's already known. But during the process, this consciousness raising also can always be taking place. To me, it's putting experience into articulation, experiencing what comes back from your comrades, your colleagues. It's not a great answer, but anybody else have some ideas about that one?
I was just kind of wondering how it relates to the last thing you said. So in your example of the meeting you're talking about, and maybe I missed a step in the explanation from Kant to Hegel, but is when your colleague says something that seemed to ring true and actually articulate for other people what was going on, how does that relate to this idea that that somehow, even when we're co-creating enthusiastically, even when we're participating enthusiastically in the co-creation of oppression, that we might not be able to check and realize that it's oppressive? Now, how does that relate to that transcendental I, maybe even the previous question about, like, I mean, it seems like any one, angle could be simply reproducing that oppression, or it could be, as you're suggesting, liberating in the case of your colleague, I guess, right, and helping.
So that's an excellent question. So in the case of what happened in Indiana, there was that experience of freedom. It's like self-affirmation, but not in a selfish sense. It's like collective, I don't know, it's a heightened sense that we are, of being. It's a heightened sense of being. And that, I think, ultimately is a criteria for validity. If you're looking at different kinds of research, that would be the emancipatory form of research. That would be the standard for validity, and it can't be objectified, or, every person can talk about it, and that's about it. But what you said about the I, then we have to complexify the idea by distinguishing between I and me, and talking about how the I is related to me. Me is always finite. It's a claim. It's always a claim. It draws on cultural material, so it's different and different. And then it's from what comes back. Now, there's an expert on that in this room. Rochelle wrote a whole book on that. Do you want to say anything about it? She wrote a book called The Unchosen Me, which is exactly about this issue.
Yeah, well, and I think it had to do a lot with the Hegelian recognition desires too, of wanting to be a part of something and also wanting to be unique.
Yeah.
It's sort of, but it's like you can't ever capture this I thing. It's like you keep knowing that that's not who you are, that's not who you are, that's not who you are, that's not who you are.
Yeah.
And that's the only way you can sort of capture capture that I, is just knowing that it's not who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I mean, ultimately, it was a sad story. I think in that book, where people felt like really imposed upon with their identity.
It was a really good. It was a study I respect very much, because Rochelle didn't just study people; she worked with people, and it was great. Tomorrow at a Brown Bag, I'm going to be showing examples of how to analyze actual concrete life story data in terms of the negative. Hegel doesn't say transcendental I, he talks about the negative, very subtle idea. So I try to show an application for life story data, and it has that I-me dialectic. Yeah?
Professor Carspecken, I did worry a bit about how you ended with, the sort of yardstick to measure knowledge and knowledge of self as well is the affirmation of, something's wrong if you don't feel to be oneself, which you connected to identity politics as well. But isn't that in some ways then the death of knowledge? I mean, can decentering the self also be a form of knowing why must I feel secure in myself in order to see
Oh, yeah,
it in a
yeah,
particular
yeah.
way? Why can my insecurity therefore actually perhaps drive a new way of knowing the other?
Sure. And then what happens? What happens to the insecurity?
And why does the self have to be claimed? Perhaps the self can be granted as well, and self-affirmation as the height of knowing seems troubling somehow.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's probably not the best way to frame it. Decentering is really important, but it's in my experience with it and understanding of it, it is a kind of a dialectical thing, because if you're feeling really insecure and then you learn how to stop fighting that, and you decenter and you locate, you're more oriented towards the group, the intersubjective structure, than to any one position in it. Well, you feel more secure. I mean, in a moments of reflection, which I don't think we escape, unless we're almost enlightened, there's a greater feeling. There's an affirmation, but self-affirmation, I think I need to change that. I agree with you. It's because if it sounds like it's one person's thing only, then a lot's missed, because we are intimately interconnected, totally. That has to come out. So what would be a better expression? Do you have, or what do you think? How would you talk about this same thing?
I was thinking probably more drawing on biologic ways of being, where the self doesn't quite need to sit in me. I mean, it never does, in honest fact, and it's not quite in the other, no matter how powerful, but somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Biological self, perhaps.
What about love? What do you think of love?
Awesome.
Well, I think of love as that's what I'm trying. I should use love more often. That's what I felt in that room. It was love, because when you feel, it's simultaneously feeling more alive, but it's loving what's around you, right? Loving. So, yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, I came into this conversation very late, so this may be off the deep end in some direction, but I'm listening to this conversation through a couple of teaching experiences and some research experiences in which people's claim to comfort is most often used to assure their own structural power within a group setting that provides a great deal of support for that. And so I'm trying to understand what aspect of this is. Are we talking about a process that can be as deeply problematic as it can be liberating, or are we talking about an approach to try to understand a movement towards more critical approaches to being and to knowing? And I came in so late that I'm not sure which it is, so I apologize.
Oh. We were just trying to clarify some of the concepts that came up, I think, and that had to do with this idea of emancipation a little bit, and as a kind of knowledge. Emancipation is a change of being. That's an interconnection there between knowing and being. We didn't say that exactly, but that. And we were wondering about how to talk about that. As self-affirmation, as love, as dialogic something or other. And we hadn't really gotten to a conclusion. But if you talk to me about specific examples of what you're talking about, that would be more helpful.
I can give you a really quick and easy one.
Yeah.
Maybe two are needed. So in a class, we're talking about whether education plays any sort of meritocratic role in the U.S. And everyone reads a piece about the federal government's, the steps the federal government took to result in deeply racially homogenized areas in urban and suburban and rural spaces. And so everyone's in small groups talking about it. And I go by one of them, and one of the guys goes, I mean, there's a lot of facts here, and I could go find out each of these facts, and so I think this is true. Like, this is probably right, but I don't like it, so I say no. And the rest of the group goes, yeah. Right? So that's one. And then the second would be, I've done research with a lot of evangelical Christians on abstinence-only education in the US. And there is a deep comfort and sense of love and both personal and group fulfillment in feeling confident that the work you're trying to do in the world is work that benefits all. But from a critical perspective, the work they're trying to do in the world creates a great deal of pain.
Right.
And so it's trying to kind of think about this notion of self-affirmation and the feedback loop in terms of those kinds of experiences.
Right. I think that's a good example. Well, my first response would be to say the way, from what I believe at the moment, based on my life and experiences, is that the feelings those people are having are valid, the love they have, and so on. But they need to be challenged, because what they are assuming is wrong. I mean, they need to be challenged. There's a difference between those feelings and the means through which they're getting them, which have to do with their beliefs. And their beliefs have problems, that's what I would say. So if they're not going to be dogmatic, if they're going to be open to someone like you saying, I really have a problem with what you're doing, can't you see the harm this is causing? To the extent they can't engage with you there, they're limited. I mean, they have to be worked against, basically. But that doesn't mean they're not experiencing something enormously valid in their community with the love. If the dogma helps them not see what they don't want to see, because that would seem to threaten the feeling that they have. But in fact, I believe if people can let go of dogma, the more we can do that, the more authentically we do experience what you're talking about, love, community, that kind of thing. You're really talking about dogmatic ideologies and what to make of them, I think. What about the rest of you? That's a real big one.
I have two questions, but they're unrelated. So one question is about language, and the other one is more about philosophy. I'm wondering, what do you see the role in our critical theories influencing research, but philosophies that are not Europe-centered?
What do I think of those?
Yeah. What do you think are some of the roles of those type? Because sometimes they're not called philosophy.
Yeah. I know.
Something else.
I know, and I don't know enough of them. I have students who've said, Kant, Hegel, these are white, male, European, privileged dudes. Let's hear something different. Well, I haven't come across anything like Hegel, especially anywhere else. But I did have a wonderful student, Phillip Vargas, if you ever ran into Philippe. And this guy, he was in a Habermas class of mine. I like Habermas too. And he was translating, he was bringing in stuff from Native American cultures. He also does that in his research. He has healing groups. He's a really awesome person. And I was hoping he'd write a whole dissertation on that, because that needs to be heard more. I need to hear it more. And a lot of people do. So I think there's a huge place for that. I think the way things are structured, it's very difficult for those voices to emerge. And I keep teaching Habermas and Hegel and Kant and stuff like that, because it's just like a calling for me. I'm just alive with that. Do you have some idea? Have you seen some good work that's helped to bring in non-European frameworks and stuff?
Very little.
Yeah, I know.
That's why I asked.
And,
Yeah,
F-
I
and
asked because I-
Felipe dropped out. He dropped out.
My second question had to do, before your talk, we were talking about a methods class that we're taking and it's considered a more advanced qualitative methods course. And we were talking about how we're not, even in this course where we're all, in the class we're all people who are going to engage in qualitative inquiry. And we can't escape in our discussions questions about validity and reliability. And I always find it interesting that we even use that language. So it seems that the language itself comes from quantitative. Thus, we are unable to escape being judged by quantitative epistemology. Can you comment on escaping the language from?
The way I do it is I have a way of explaining when you're doing reliability, you're constructing this universal observer, instrumental, actor position. When we're doing hermeneutics and meaning, you can't do that. You can't. Reliability doesn't make any sense. If we have a culture and somebody's studying us and they say, you know, I noticed that you guys seem close, but you don't complement each other. I don't see affection expressed. And let's say we say, well, yeah, I think it's because that would be bad to express affection, this is an example, directly. So we do it indirectly. And then if we read in the research report, these people don't express affection directly. There's a norm involved. They do it indirectly. We wouldn't be convinced that guy really got it. We would only be convinced that the guy could do it. And to be convincing to us that they get something, really, the limit case there is to do something objectively never done before. And we see through it. We recognize through the act what's there. We go, oh, that guy really gets it. If he can do it in a way that's never objectively done before. Not the same words, not the same action, different way of putting together gesture and so on. And so that's just so different from observational-based research where it has to be the same. What you see on the sensory level is supposed to be the same each time. So those are ways to challenge that idea of validity. Say, well, when we understand meanings and we're convinced someone understands us, how do we do that? What's going on? That's about the kind of validity we want. And it's important. You don't want some ethnographer writing about a culture in a way that no one can recognize from the group. It's damaging. So some idea of validity is important. You can think of a different name, but we got to be able to check these researchers. Did you have another one? No? Okay. Question from the back.
Can I just make a really quick comment?
Yeah.
So, are you taking 788 or 789?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that we've had a conversation about within the qualitative research methods group is the fact that we have a pretty broad diversity of qualitative research epistemological stances within our group, and that leads to really different sounding conversations around these topics. And we are looking for ideas about ways, we're putting together a video series to have people talk about some of these issues from really different perspectives, but we love your feedback about places, times, words, descriptions, etc., where you'd like to have a sense of how else it might be talked about within different traditions.
That'd be good. Yeah. Think about your dissertation. Do something radical. Help change people. Yeah.
I get kicked out.
No, you won't. You get the right people on your committee. Is that it? I'm surprised anyone came, really. I thought probably 3 people come up. I'll just say, let's sit around and talk. So I think this is speaks a lot for the culture you have here in your education school. And thank you all for coming. Thank you. Okay. Let's clap for each other.